Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Philip R. Reilly, author of the book Abraham Lincoln's DNA and Other Adventures in Genetics. Welcome to Rip Rap, Philip.
Great to be here, thanks.
Of course, before we begin, I'm obliged to remark that this is a real historic moment, since this is the first time Rip Rap has participated in a new community-based initiative called Ann Arbor Reads that involves all of our local community, Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they're reading and discussing one book. It happens to be yours during the period from January through March, and that this local initiative is modeled on similar efforts in over 100 cities across the country. Since Rip Rap is the only television program in the United States that focuses solely on academic books, we're extremely pleased to have you here as a guest and to do what we can to help such an initiative that features prominent partners like the University of Michigan's Life, Science, Values, and Society program, Shaman Drum Bookstore, and the Ann Arbor District Library. We are also extremely impressed with the members of the initiative Blue Ribbon Committee, which includes David Cantor, the head of the Pfizer Global Research and Development, Mary Sue Coleman, the president of the University of Michigan, and David Sharp, the publisher of the Ann Arbor News. We'd also like to recognize the 6 members of the Ann Arbor Reads screening team, especially our own friend and mentor, Carl Port, and the 8 additional people who served on the selection committee. Well, sorry for that long introduction, but I think it's also, and I think it's one of the lengthiest we've ever done. In fact, I know that. But we wanted to give credit to all the people who've organized this project. Sure. But in a way, this introduction also parallels your own rather long path into the study of some of the questions evoked by the study of genetics, since along the way you've become both an attorney and a physician in a passage of over 28 years. The reasons for your career decisions and the intellectual questions you raise were and still are a good place to begin this discussion.
My interest in genetics began in a very unlikely place, in the quadrangle of Columbia Law School during the middle of my second year of being a law student. It was 1973. I was a young guy, uncertain about my way in life, and I had the nagging sensation that I would only be happy in law if I could fit it together with some other discipline. I had thought about anthropology and economics, and I still remember this moment. It's the closest thing in my life I've had to an epiphany. I was walking across the quadrangle late one snowy night, and I said, genetics. I must have been reading something about genetics in the papers or in a Scientific American. I said, that's got to have a huge impact on people as we learn more about genetics, and in turn, you'll have to have a huge impact on how our society operates with genetic information. And I've really never looked back since then, and pretty much it has been a theme for almost 30 years now in my life.
Well, and as you point out in the introduction, these are really 2 books. And one part is this collection of 24 stories with the different topics: history, justice, behavior, plants and animals, diseases, and ethical dilemmas. Right.
One of the things that I noticed over and over again in the last 20 years was when I, as a physician geneticist, would engage non-scientists, they would tend to put up their hands and say, oh, it's genetics. I really don't know anything about it. I can't learn about that. And one, I was sure that was untrue, that genetics was a very teachable subject. And 2, I was convinced that it was a very dangerous thing for society to have a tyranny of expertise, if you will, about a science and a technology that I thought carried such power. I think I've turned out to be right on both fronts. Certainly, compared to even 10 or 15 years ago, the power of genetics to unearth important information about humans and other organisms on this planet is growing at a tremendous pace, and the need for individuals to engage about the uses of this knowledge is growing at a similar pace. So I deliberately conceived of a book that would trick people into learning genetics. And so I tried to conceive of topics that would engage them much the way I might engage somebody at a cocktail party, but slip in genetic knowledge without them even knowing it. So if you take, for example, one of the chapters, as you know, I write in the book is about the artist Toulouse-Lautrec. And in that brief chapter, I I use stories about his art to explain the concept of an autosomal recessive disorder, to explore issues like consanguinity, population, genetics, and then the disease itself that he suffered with and how scientists learned what that was. And so far I have a sense that I have succeeded. A lot of people have told me that, gee, I never thought I could read a book about genetics, and here they are doing it, and they like it very much.
Well, of course, you've got the title, Abraham's DNA.
Yeah, that's a, well, I have a confession to make about that. When I was thinking about how to organize the book, I had read an essay somewhere that said that the two most common words found in titles of books in English were dog and Abraham Lincoln. So I toyed with calling it Abraham Lincoln's dog's DNA, but that would have been fraudulent. And the truth of the matter is that one of the many privileges I've had in life is to be appointed to a blue ribbon committee to explore whether or not to actually test Abraham Lincoln's skull fragments to see if he had a certain genetic disease. One of the great dividends of having gone to school as long as I did, becoming a clinical geneticist and a lawyer, is that being, I think, the only person in the country who actually is formally trained and has practiced both genetics and law, you might expect that I get a lot of invitations to explore policy issues, and many of the stories in that book come out of those invitations. Abraham Lincoln's DNA being one of them.
Well, you say that maybe he had Marfan's.
Right. The way this particular the title and chapter of the book came about was that as our technology, our ability to study bits of DNA matured, there, among the many events that flowed from that, was a renewed interest in applying molecular biological techniques to questions in history. Most people are familiar with the death of Abraham Lincoln. He's assassinated. He doesn't die instantly, however. He's carried across the street to a rooming house, and he stays barely alive for about 12 hours. During the course of that time, a number of people had blood from his body spilled on their garments. A surgeon removed a bit of hair and fragments from his skull. These fragments wound up in what is now the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology Museum in Washington, and they've stayed there almost as a kind of national relic. Now that we have the ability, in some ways, to look at old tissue and ask questions about its DNA, it was not surprising that about 10 years ago, somebody proposed asking whether DNA had this disease, Marfan syndrome. He fits the pattern of Marfan's. People with Marfan syndrome are very tall, have long limbs. Those are the two distinctive features that you can see. They have other problems involving their aorta and their vision sometimes. Victor McCusick, a very famous geneticist, indeed perhaps the dean of American clinical geneticists, is an expert on Marfan syndrome. And he had long thought that there was a 50-50 chance that Abraham Lincoln had Marfan's. So one thing led to another, and when the proposal was made, Congress actually has oversight of this museum where Abraham Lincoln's tissue is. And Congress convened a blue ribbon committee to, if you will, assess the ethics of whether or not it would be right to test Abraham Lincoln's bone fragments. And a lot of interesting issues came out, privacy issues. What if there was a living descendant of Abraham Lincoln, and therefore we might inadvertently violate that person's privacy? Do historical figures have privacy, or is it extinguished at death? Would it change our conception of him as an individual if it turned out he had a disease? How? Would it change thoughts about the reconstruction of the South if he had lived? For example, if it turned out that he had Marfan syndrome, he very likely would not have lived very long anyway, so assassin's bullet or not, he probably would not have been around, or might not have been around for reconstruction. Well, the anticlimax is that in the end, we decided, after consulting with experts, that we didn't quite have the technology available to answer this very hard question. And the reason for that is simple. As time goes by, the DNA molecule in a cell gets chopped up. When you're looking for a mutation in a gene that might cause Marfan syndrome, we know what the gene is, but we might have only been able to find little bits of it. And it would have been a matter of pure luck if we found a bit that had a mutation. So we decided we couldn't fully answer the question. But someday we might. We still have the tissue. We might revisit it in the future.
Well, that story evokes two things in my mind. One is that there's other historical figures you mentioned, like the Russian czars.
I really enjoyed the Tsar story because I think all of us in America who are old enough have grown up with knowing about Anastasia, the supposed surviving daughter of the Tsar, and what really happened to them. And here's an example where DNA really did answer the question. When the bones that purported to be those of the Tsar's family were finally uncovered in about a decade ago, we already had in place techniques using something called the study of mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria are little circles of DNA that are in your cells, and they're transmitted through the maternal line. It became possible to do some DNA sleuthing to see whether DNA that might be in the bones that were uncovered and purported to be the Tsar's family matched DNA from known living descendants of the Tsar. And to make a very complex story brief, by studying the DNA of about 5 living persons and some remaining tissue samples from dead relatives, scientists were able to establish, I believe, conclusively both that the bones were from the Tsar's family and that the woman who claimed to be Anastasia was absolutely no relation to the Tsar's family.
But the other issue also, there's a twofold part to this. One is that, as you mentioned earlier, people think that genetics isn't a part of their lives, and yet when you start tracing these stories out, there really is all kinds of ways that it comes to be a part of our life. Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, I would argue confidently that there is not a person on the planet whose life isn't really touched by the developments in genetic knowledge, and it's one of the great arguments for reading the book. Take, for example, one of my favorite topics is the impact of genetics on the criminal justice system. Every state in the United States now, every single state, has what's called a DNA felon data banking law. Depending on the crime you commit, you may be required to give up a tissue sample. Your DNA is analyzed, a kind of genetic fingerprint is created, and it's stored indefinitely in a interactive computer database. All the state databases can essentially talk to each other. So to give a rather astounding example of how this is working, in the United States today, in the state of Virginia, which is a kind of in the forefront of this, almost every day a violent crime is solved by comparing the DNA from the crime scene, usually from a rape victim, to a DNA in a computer data bank. And what's called a cold hit is made, where with no other knowledge about the perpetrator, because he has committed crimes before and his DNA is in a data bank, a match is found, and the individuals know very likely who it is. I might hasten to point out that DNA evidence has also been tremendously important in exonerating the wrongfully accused.
There's been some pretty dramatic examples of that.
There have been some extraordinary ones. Most recently, of course, the DNA evidence contributed to the decision by the Illinois governor to commute the sentences of a number of individuals. It was part of his assessment of the weakness of the criminal justice system when it came to capital crimes. But right now, as we speak, in the state of Louisiana, there's one of the, not the very first, but one of the first DNA dragnets going on in the United States. There have been 4 women at least killed by one man. We know it's one man because DNA samples from the semen match. There's a very good sense for the geography of the crimes, and law enforcement officials, whether rightly or wrongly, are asking large numbers of men between the ages of about 16 and 60 to voluntarily give a DNA sample and to essentially rule them out as suspects in the crime. A large number of men are coming forward to do that, but there is certainly a deep concern that their civil liberties are being violated, because of course if you refuse to come forward, there's this sense, well, maybe this is the guilty guy. We, oddly enough, although DNA forensics has really permeated our criminal justice system very rapidly, there's been, I think, much too little public discourse about it and what it means for civil liberties, and that's the reason I put 4 chapters in the book about DNA and law.
Well, and that's the aspect of your role as attorney, it seems, the awareness of the legal issues that are raised by this.
Right. I hopefully enrich the dialogue. I had a fascinating experience for 2 years recently. Then Attorney General Janet Reno appointed me to the National Commission on the Future of DNA Evidence. And it was quite an interesting experience because on one side of the table would be arrayed the sort of attorney generals from the states and the prosecuting attorneys. The other side would be the civil liberties attorneys and a couple of DNA experts. In the middle would be myself and one other geneticist, a fellow from the University of Wisconsin, and we were sort of mediating between these two very different views of law enforcement, and I think had a lot of influence actually because we were seen as honest brokers of the science. So I've had a lot of fun. My most fun in this world has been trying to see help people understand how genetics impacts far beyond their visits to their doctor's office.
But in the back of my mind, as I was reading the book, I kept wondering, what are we going to do with these test results? And, what are those issues that are raised by having them on file?
It's a hugely important question. We're at the stage where I guess it's fair to say a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. We know a lot, but we're still only at the beginning. Let us say that, to take a common example, genes for breast cancer, about 5 to 10% of women who develop breast cancer do so because of a genetic risk they're born with. There's a test available for that now, so if a woman has a significant family history, she can get the test. But what does she do with the results? There are some people who think the results are extremely helpful, and there are other people who think the opposite. On the positive side, the results can reinforce careful health behaviors to monitor for risk, reinforce healthy diets, avoiding alcohol, regular checkups, early intervention if there is a lump detected. On the negative side, people worry that these women, once they're tested, will be denied insurance coverage or charged a higher premium or be stigmatized in some way in the workplace. There's been a huge amount of discussion about this. So far, thankfully, I think there's very few examples of genetic discrimination. An even tougher one, and one I think is more immediate, is, most healthcare information, not all, but most healthcare information is information about an individual. But in this new world of genetic medicine, when I find out a fact about somebody that's genetic, it has immediate inferences for his parents, his siblings, and his children. So the whole principle and notion of confidentiality has to be restructured over the next 10 or 15 years as genetics becomes really commonplace in medicine, as it will. 10 years from now, people will be, their DNA will be tested routinely for many things. I might add, a lot of people listening to the show probably don't realize just how extensive genetic testing is. Every newborn in the United States undergoes genetic testing. That's been true since 1962 for rare, treatable diseases, but the number of diseases is growing very rapidly. 300,000 women a year undergo prenatal genetic testing. 2 million women a year undergo prenatal testing regarding another disorder called spina bifida. Carrier testing to see if people are at risk for bearing children with diseases is growing rapidly. So it's really actually out there more than people realize. And again, that was a reason I wrote the book, saying, hey, let's start thinking about what we're going to do with this information.
In situations like cystic fibrosis, it could be something where someone could become aware of the possibility and then deal with it. But on the other hand, then if someone were to get a job and they have, like you said, the workplace kind of situation, right, how far can that go?
Right. The cystic fibrosis genetic testing may turn out to be the most important experience we have because cystic fibrosis is, quote unquote, a white disease. It is the genetic disorder that's sort of most commonly prevalent in the white middle class. About 1 in 28 white Americans is a carrier of the gene. About 1 in 700-800 children is born with the disease. About 2 years ago, the government, National Institutes of Health, issued a consensus panel sort of statement that sort of said, anybody, regardless of the lack of family history, anyone thinking about marrying and having children should have a cystic fibrosis test. That's a big change. That's a big change. And we went from having about, these are rough numbers, 50,000 carrier tests a year This year we probably had 500,000, so it's gone up tenfold in about 3 or 4 years. And I think it'll go to a couple million pretty rapidly over the next few years. So the broad question is, what about genetic information in the workplace? Cystic fibrosis carrier testing probably won't have a huge impact on that, but imagine the day, not so far from now, where we show that a lot of occupational lung diseases have a genetic component. Not absolute, but just a genetic risk profile. Is it right or wrong for an employer to say to a new employee, look, you're going to be exposed to this chemical in our workplace, and you might be one of the 1 in 100 people who has a gene that for you exposure to this chemical is very bad, and we think you should know about it. Some employees may say, I want to know, I'll be tested. Some may refuse. If they refuse and then they develop the disease, can they sue the employer? Or has the employer sort of discharged his obligation by warning them? We've already had examples of lawsuits like that involving other areas besides genetics, and there'll be more of them in the future.
Well, another area I thought was kind of problematic was Alzheimer's, because it won't develop immediately, but it could be there and be an element. And so again, it might be something where if you were tested on a broad spectrum of things and that showed up, then how would that prejudice, how you're being handled?
Well, I think that's a very important question to address. First of all, as you know, it's fair to say that we face an epic of Alzheimer's disease. The one thing there's many things about Alzheimer's disease we don't know, but the one thing we know is that the older the population is, the more we age, the more prevalent Alzheimer's disease is. So there are several million people in the United States right now with Alzheimer's disease, and that number is just going to go up and up and up. It's really not a treatable disorder yet, but we have found a number of genes that predispose to Alzheimer's disease, one quite commonly found in the population. And it raises this question of do you want to have knowledge about a risk you face in the future if there's really nothing you can do about it? Now, some people come down on the side of knowing, and some people come down on the side of not knowing. I can certainly imagine situations where one might not want to know that they carry a gene that predisposes to Alzheimer's. If for nothing else, what if they were trying to buy long-term care insurance to arrange for their care when they were very old and debilitated? If the insurance company knew this, it might really change the premium structure.
Another thing that came to mind as I read the book is there's this theme about genetic manipulation, or however you want to, there's transgenic animals and plants, and people have various reactions depending on the topic in there.
Sure. That's another example of how far genetics is moving through our society. Relatively few people have really thought hard about the fact that we're totally changing the way we practice agriculture on this planet. There are tens of millions of acres in the United States planted with genetically engineered seed. Now, it's only a slight manipulation. It's designed to protect the seed from a certain natural pest. I think it's probably a very good thing. I'll state my prejudice openly. But clearly, we have failed to educate not only at home, but even more so abroad about the risk-benefit profile. A lot of people, when they talk about things like genetically engineering food or animals, they suggest that we should not be playing God. Well, what I say back to them is, aren't we playing God when we're dumping tens of thousands of tons of pollutants into the water and into the atmosphere? And what if we could use genetic techniques to, for example, slow down the destruction of the rainforest, increase the per acre yield of crops in the third world, try to save some of the ecosystems? Now, that may seem a little Pollyannish, but I actually believe it's possible. One of the saddest things for me about the whole discussions about genetically modified food is I think the scientific community has failed quite miserably to educate the public about its benefits. And I don't know whether that was corporate arrogance in the past, or indifference, or just plain ignorance. But I think one of the messages of this book is we need to build bridges in all sorts of directions in our society so that people don't reflexively dismiss or characterize some genetic advances as threatening or bad. In fact, I can think of few things that have done more good for the world, in my opinion, than genetically engineered food.
Well, another thing along the issue of that is something with the reproduction. I mean, the human reproduction with frozen embryos, and then not quite yet, but in terms of animals, cloning.
Right. Our advances in human and animal reproductive technology are mind-boggling. Just take beginning with animals, and just think that it's only been about a little over 4 years really since the announcement of the cloning of the sheep Dolly. There are now many, many reports from reputable laboratories around the world of cloning other large mammals, cows, mice, monkeys, things like that. That raises the question of is it the right thing to do? Some people have a particular ethical view that says that that's wrong, we shouldn't do it. I respect that. Not everyone is going to think that way. For human reproductive cloning, I think the vision is almost overwhelming that we should not be doing it now because it's too dangerous. We cannot predict that a fetus born via human reproductive cloning would be healthy. It's very likely that it would be diseased and deformed. It would be, I think, totally unethical to do that experiment. But by the same token, I also can imagine a day when it will be technically feasible, maybe not morally right. Interestingly, in a recent survey, about 25% of American men said they could accept human reproductive cloning under some circumstances. So it's not quite as one-sided as some people think on the ethical debate.
Well, as I pointed out in my talking points that I sent you earlier, is that we had interviewed a bioethicist, Arthur Kaplan, and he pointed out in our discussions with him that, once you modify the gene pool, you can't call something back.
Well, that's, of course, true to an extent, but, to the extent that people, when they think of that statement, think of infectious disease, you've got to be careful. The gene pool, the human gene pool, is 6 billion people's genomes. It is very, very, very hard for me to imagine how we could alter the human gene pool in any significant way just because of the sheer numbers. If I introduce a gene in a few thousand people, it's not going to affect the gene pool in any meaningful way. Evolution takes many, many generations to have effects like that. Certainly, at the level of bacteria and viruses, however, a genetic change could spread through the population very quickly, and I think it's right to be very concerned about things like bioterrorism and the ecosystem in that regard. But I also think that what Kaplan's remarks strike me as is a restatement of what's called the precautionary principle. Don't move forward unless you're absolutely sure. Well, then you can't move forward at all because you can never guarantee perfect safety in any enterprise.
Well, your book is a wonderful exploration of all these issues, and it certainly has got people in this area reading, and the program we broadcast to potentially 3.3 million more. So thank you for appearing on Rip Rap.
Thank you. It was fun to talk with you.